Welcome back to our month with generosity, and we'll start with a reminder of what we talked about last week, that generosity is the fruit of the gospel. And unlike a gift, which is some gifts are given to some and not to others, generosity will be manifest in the life of every believer, because it is a fruit of the gospel. Now, if you hear that as the law and you find yourself discouraged by that, thinking, well, I'm not terribly generous, well, I want to encourage you to see it as a promise, meaning that if this fruit, um, that it's a fruit, not a work, and so the place to turn when you don't see it in your life is not to yourself. You don't turn inward and try to make yourself more generous, but rather turn to the Lord and experience His grace and His mercy. And it's that outpouring of God's grace and mercy that will bear the fruit of generosity in your own life. Now, today I want to look at generosity in terms of our relationships, and I want to touch on just 2 points. 2 points briefly that I made in my sermon, and then move on to a third element to consider. Now, the first point is, how do we regard each other? And do we approach a person with an open or a closed attitude? I like to call this uh, giving people time to prove themselves jerks. That's the cynical side of me. But what I mean by that is that you just don't say, well, that person's a jerk, right? You actually spend some time to sit down and get to know them. And we just live in a time, and that it's just so common to assume that people we disagree with are operating in bad faith, and some of them are. And the truth is that some people are jerks, but not everyone is, and you don't know that if you just view everyone through the lens of being operating in bad faith, or being a jerk, right? My point is to not start relationships at a deficit, to seek to understand where the other person is coming from, and to assume within that they're trying to do what they see as right and loving and just. Now, that of course does not mean that they are, right. The book of Judges reminded us of what happens when everyone does what was right in their own eyes, but to seek and so what we're trying to do in our generosity is to find commonality and connection, before we find disagreement. And when you do this, what you hopefully will find is the ability to agree to disagree. In other words, that you don't sever the relationship over places that you don't see eye to eye. Now, I'm not talking about gospel matters here. Within the church, it's an act of generosity to offer gentle but firm correction on matters of error in relationship to the gospel. But still, I would say approaching someone with generosity gives you the best chance of those conversations actually going well. My point is that generosity is not about compromising the truth. It's about speaking the truth in love, which means that it's ultimately about how you hold that person in your heart. Is it about you being right, or is it about you seeking to love them? Um, and generosity is great because it never depends on them. It's more about you, in the sense that generosity is never about the worthiness of the one receiving it, but it's about the heart of the one who is offering it. And that brings me to my second point about generosity in relationships, and that is forgiveness. When Jesus says we are to forgive each other 7 times 7, he's making just such an absurd statement that the disciples are befuddled by. Who can forgive someone that many times? And the answer, of course, is only someone who realizes that God has forgiven them of so much more. If you find yourself struggling with forgiveness and saying, I just can't find it in myself to forgive so and so, well, that's absolutely right. You will never find the ability to forgive someone else within yourself. You will only find it in knowing that God has forgiven you. Because our ability to forgive each other an astronomical amount of times comes not from us, but from the grace of God. And how do you experience that grace of God? By seeking forgiveness for all that you have done. And so how do we learn to love someone based not on their worthiness? Well, we look to God, and we see how God continues to offer grace to us based not on my worthiness, but on his love for me. All right, so those are the first 2 points. Is that one, that we approach each other with a generous spirit, not a culture of suspicion. And secondly, is that we are quick and plentiful in our forgiveness. And my third point is about generosity in relationships, is that we lift each other up. And once more, I'll turn to Gretchen Renovick for a story about her grandfather, which I just think illustrates this point perfectly. And pardon me, we're having slight technical difficulties here. We're still recording, but my pages crashed for a second, so I was without my notes. All right. So this is a story about her grandfather, and she says, my grandpa, was one of the most generous people I know. He was probably one of the poorest. He worked in missions and church planning at the time when pastors really didn't save for retirement. He had a knack for flipping houses, so they lived off that income in their later years. When I say he was generous, I didn't mean he gave people lots of money, though I'd never known him to not fight for a check at a restaurant. When my grandpa or any of his siblings came into a room full of relatives at a family reunion, they would go straight for a child, and they would look each in the eye and tell them how precious they were and how much Jesus loved them. They always started with the children. And this is a quote from her grandfather, because they're the most important, my grandfather would say. He taught me through example to always sit at the least important part of the table at a holiday, not because I wanted to be asked to be at the head of the table, because the lowest spot was actually where the real treasure was. One of the things many of his dependents remember about his generosity, though, was his generous apologies. When he apologized, he did so without any buts. His apologies were never, ever qualified or lessened. He never made you feel ashamed for being mad or struggling to forgive or just needing time. He would take whatever blame he could. It was almost as if the shame of being in the wrong couldn't touch him, so he took as much of the blame as possible. He would be generous with his restitution. It was like he had a secret stash of grace, so that he could take whatever blame upon himself and not be crushed, because he had the antidote easily at his disposal. He wasn't flippant. He was just that convinced of God's grace for him, and that he literally had nothing to lose. When he went to his house, there were always treats. He gave bear hugs. He looked people in the eye and made them feel honored. I will not let the discussion of generosity fall into the mostly monetary category, because the most generous man I knew was also the poorest. Now, there's not much more that I can add to that. She really covers it all there, doesn't everything that we've talked about there, right? In the example of her grandfather, a man who understood that generosity flowed not from money or resources, but from a grace that we experienced with God. Someone who showed generosity in the way that they related to other people, always thinking the best of them, seeking to have them sit at the places of honor rather than himself. And that he was quick to forgive and quick to ask for forgiveness. I would just add 2 anecdotal things from my own life that this story brings to mind as we talk about generosity. The first is that I don't necessarily remember a lot about church growing up. But I do remember a man who was very, very kind, and I think taught me a lot about grace without words, and we just called him the Candy Man. I'm still not sure. I don't remember his name, but I do remember that he always wore a suit, because he wore a suit back in those days. And if you would go up to him after the service, he would reach into his suit jacket or his blazer, and he would pull out some candy for you to take home, and we just called him the Candy Man, and they named the church playground after him. And it's just an example of someone who I think was just incredibly generous, and it wasn't a big thing necessarily, but I guarantee you I'm not the only one of the kids in that church who remember him and remember him fondly, and just the example of grace that he was in our lives. The second is one of the things that I always pay attention to when someone like a bishop or someone in authority who has a lot of power, I guess, is around is how they interact with children. Because you can really see a person's heart and how they interact with kids. And the reason for that is that there's nothing that a kid can do for a bishop or a CEO or a president or any number of things, right? That kids are completely powerless. But the way that someone regards and shows kindness to the least of these, I think, really is a key insight in understanding and seeing into their heart. And that's why Jesus said, "Blessed, let the children come to me and be blessed." And so shall we. I think that's all that I have to say for today. So I'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.